On June 22, 1950, famous actress Judy Garland, known for playing Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, was found dead at just 47 years old. During the autopsy, it was ruled that she had overdosed on barbiturates, which was a common sleep aid at the time. The coroner announced that it was quite clearly an accidental circumstance to a person who was accustomed to taking barbiturates over a long period of time. Unfortunately, Garland had a long history with pills, both to keep her energy up to perform and to help her sleep afterwards, all starting around the age of 10 years old. Drug and alcohol abuse is common in the Hollywood scene. Of course, in today's world, there's much more than just drug and alcohol addiction to be worried about. With modern technology, addiction to social media and pornography is more common than ever. Now, instead of cigarettes, kids are addicted to vapes. Addiction is not just part of Hollywood. It is seen in millions of people around the world, and the problem continues to grow. Addiction has been around for a very long time, but it was recognized as a moral failure, and everyone went about treating it the wrong way. There are many types of addiction, including drugs, alcohol, social media, and pornography. Addictions have a long history that is difficult to find the beginning of. Opium smoking began when early Europeans in America found out that Indians were smoking tobacco in pipes. Some people started mixing opium with the tobacco in their pipes, and that became the preferred way of taking opium. In 1804, morphine was isolated from opium, and after the Civil War, drastically increased the number of addicts. In early America, addiction was seen as a criminal offense and was treated with prayer or mental institutions. In some cases, addiction was even seen as demon possession. All of this changed when one of the founding fathers of America and father of American psychiatry, Benjamin Rush, recognized that addiction is not just a moral failure, but was something else entirely. However, it wasn't until 1864, 51 years after Rush's death, that the New York State Inebriate Asylum, the first hospital to treat alcoholism as a mental condition, was created. Since then, we have learned much more about addiction and know how to treat it. With technology, we have more ways to treat addiction, but there are more things to be addicted to. One type of addiction that started much more recently is social media addiction. It started in the late 90s and early 2000s with places like 6degrees.com, Friendster, and MySpace. In 2004, we saw Facebook, followed by Reddit and YouTube. In 2006 was the start of Twitter, now known as X. The smartphone started to improve, and soon everyone had one. Now, social media addiction is extremely common and is often overlooked. With the smartphone came the increase in pornography. Pornography has been around for a long time, as seen on cave art, drawings, pottery, and sculpture. As humans advanced, porn followed in print, film, and now the internet, allowing for the ability to access porn anonymously and affordably. Webcam technology improved so much that just about anyone was able to become a porn star themselves. Now, porn is easily accessible, and anyone can view it. Another way technology has made addiction more common is with vapes. They exploded in popularity in 2010 when the technology improved in the vapes, giving people more options in flavor and adding mods. Vapes were seen as a way to quit smoking and continued to spread. In 2022, a study found that roughly 8% of Americans had vaped in the week prior to the study. Like any other substance or behavior mentioned, vapes are extremely addictive. It is important to realize that there's always a cost when it comes to these addictions and to stay clear from them. There's a long history of illness and death with any addictive substance, and we need to watch out for it. Addiction is something that affects millions of people every day. It costs money, time, and lives. Substance abuse and addiction cost Americans billions of dollars every year. In addition, there are over 40 million serious illnesses and injuries directly linked to substance addiction, with more than 200,000 deaths worldwide. This shows just how costly addiction is, not just in money, but in the health and the lives of addicts. With this much money spent and lives lost, there is no choice but to acknowledge the harm that addiction causes. Most people can agree on what addiction is. There isn't really much room for debate when it comes to defining the word. In an article titled Behaviors, Habits, Addictions, and Eating Disorders, Barbara Wexler says, addiction is a physical or mental need for a substance or activity. Most people are only talking about drugs when they mention addiction. However, it is much more than that. It's a physical or mental need for any substance or activity, not just a few things. Some of the things that can fall under the scope of addiction are drugs, gambling, pornography, social media and internet, and smoking. Obviously, addiction is a major issue. It is made even more serious when you include the fact that it's extremely common in adolescents, not just adults. In her article titled Addiction, Barbara Sternberg said that nearly 1.2 million adolescents reported binge drinking, and 38.4% of young adults ages 18 to 25 were binge alcohol users. This is a major problem. Another serious problem is the fact that addictions first appear the most in adolescence. The 2016 National Survey of Drug Use and Health, or NSDUH, also found that 7.9% of adolescents, people aging from 12 to 17, were actively using an illicit drug. At PEP, Core A starts in 7th grade. The students in Core A are usually around 12 years old. That means, according to this study, around 7.9% of people from the ages as young as Core A all the way through Core F were actively using an illicit drug in 2016. Drugs are not the only problem in today's society. Pornography is another huge issue that is only getting worse. Porn is a growing problem that increases as technology advances. With a lot of children having unrestricted internet access, this allows kids to view porn. Often they are just curious about sex and turn to pornography to learn, but what they see is unrealistic and gives them a distorted view of what to expect in relationships, and it also leads to addictions and suffering. It doesn't help that porn is targeting these young children to expand their platforms. In an article titled "The Porn Industry is Targeting Your Kids and Teens, What Can You Do?", Diana Alexander says that one of the most successful ways that the porn industry targets kids and teenagers is through the use of social media apps. Pornographers have taken advantage of this by creating profiles designed to appeal to teens. People can make pornographic content and target anyone with it. It is disgusting that they purposefully target teens, yet they still do it anyways. Being exposed to porn at a young age will negatively affect the brain of the addict. They start young while their brain isn't fully developed, and by the time they realize their mistake, it is far too late. Addiction today, often overlooked and even romanticized in today's society, is a serious problem affecting many that should be met with seriousness and sobriety. Addiction is not a choice in the eyes of the addict. It's a need. The addict feels that they can't function without their substance or behavior, so they continue to use or do it. So how do people become addicted, and what makes them keep doing it? In a YouTube video by Clara Liao, uploaded by Yale Medicine, she describes the steps that people have to take in order to become addicted. Whenever we do something that we need to survive, our brain releases dopamine as a reward. Dopamine is a chemical neurotransmitter that affects the brain, making a person want to repeat their behavior. When a person does something pleasurable, their brain releases large amounts of dopamine, which leads them to seek more. Liao explains that burst of dopamine is a satisfying jolt, encouraging you to repeat the same action in the future. She later says that the problem is that addictive substances hijack our natural reward system. Every substance has slightly different actions on the brain, but one thing all addictive drugs have in common is that they produce a pleasurable surge of dopamine. The reason that drugs are so addictive is because of the dopamine they release, making the person want to use them more. Every time they use a substance or indulge in an activity, they feel like they've been rewarded and they want more. Never mind. Liao says that addictive drugs flood the reward pathways with dopamine 10 times higher than a natural reward would. When that happens, natural rewards feel insignificant, leading the addict to only seek out what gives them the most dopamine. So what happens from here? Clara Liao concludes the video by saying the overall effect is to have drug-seeking behavior driven by habit rather than conscious thought, like a reflex instead of a choice. Addicts seek out dopamine without even thinking about it. It becomes natural to them, and they have no choice but to keep doing it. In her article, Barbara Wexler says that addiction is dependence. Infants, for example, are dependent on their parents for sustenance and other basic needs, such as shelter. Addicted people are dependent on the substance to function normally and to feel good. Addicts do not have a choice. They depend entirely on their addiction due to their trained reliance on dopamine delivery and can't break away from it. They are drawn to their addiction like a moth to a flame. In order to feel good at all, they need to have their substance. Addiction is often overlooked in today's society. In an article titled "A Blind Eye to Addiction," Lloyd Sederer says, "Addiction is America's most neglected disease." Despite there being millions of addicts, Sederer also says only 1 in 10 people with addiction to alcohol and/or drugs report receiving any treatment at all. In 2010, over 38,000 people died from drug overdoses alone. That is more deaths than vehicle accidents, homicides, and suicides. Roughly 70% of people with hypertension or diabetes receive treatment, while only 1 in 10 addicts get help. We should be treating addiction the same as any other disease, but instead it gets overlooked and people can't get the help they need. In today's world, social media addiction is a growing problem. With apps like TikTok and Instagram, kids and young adults are more addicted than ever. It is easy to lose your sense of time while on social media, and it can get to the point where that is the only thing a person is looking forward to. On a similar note, pornography is easier to access than ever. With platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat, pornographers can easily take advantage of people. In her article, Diana Alexander says, most kids are curious about sex and may turn to pornography to learn about it. However, the pornographic content they find is distorted, unrealistic, misogynistic, racist, and completely devoid of intimacy. They learn an untrue version of what intimacy is supposed to be like, and it can change their thoughts and behaviors. Porn teaches kids that sex is a selfish act and takes away the worth of the partner. Even with all of that, porn is still easily spread, and most social media apps fail to get rid of it. With how many people are addicted to social media, it is inevitable that a large portion of them will encounter pornography. It is something that is seriously overlooked and needs to change. Not only is addiction overlooked, it is even romanticized. In the opening monologue from the 1996 movie Trainspotting, narrator Mark Renton says, "I chose not to choose life. I chose something else. And the reasons? There are no reasons. Who needs reasons when you've got heroin?" In the series Euphoria, it is often shown how the use of drugs makes the users feel good and doesn't talk about the negative effects of drug use. In an article titled "The Portrayal of Addiction in the Media," the author says some movies and shows that raise concerns about addiction representation include the Rat Pack, the Ocean's movies, and the Fast and Furious series. These movies depict cool, clever, and cunning characters that use substances with seemingly no ill effects. These are just a few examples of how addiction is romanticized just on TV. There are also many songs that portray drugs and sex in a lighter view. Romanticizing something that ruins or even ends millions of lives is not good. At this point, it is something that is almost impossible to avoid, no matter how hard a person may try. So what are the consequences of addiction? First, there is the monetary cost. In her article, Barbara Sternberg says that substance use and addiction cost Americans about $450 billion annually in healthcare costs, plus additional costs for lost earnings, accidents, and crime. Just in America, substance abuse costs over $450 billion, and that didn't include everything else that had happened as a side effect. Obviously, there is also a large amount of physical damage that comes from addiction. Sternberg also said that every year Americans experience more than 40 million debilitating illnesses or injuries as a result of tobacco, alcohol, and other addictive drug use. More than 200,000 people worldwide die every year from drug overdoses and drug-related illnesses. In the 2018 NSDUH, it was found that 11.7% of the US population was using some kind of illicit drug during the month prior to the survey. Some examples of the drugs used are marijuana, cocaine, heroin, various hallucinogens and inhalants, and non-prescribed prescription psychotherapeutics. Addiction doesn't just affect adults. The study included children as young as 12 who were using drugs. Is this really what we want? Do we really need a world where children are using drugs? Barbara Sternberg said that in 2016, nearly 1.2 million adolescents reported binge drinking. Addiction can start at any age. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you start drinking or using drugs, it will ruin your life. Despite all of the evidence showing just how bad it is, there are still people who downplay the severity of addiction. In an article titled "Addiction is Not a Disease and We're Treating Addicts Incorrectly," Kyle Smith says, "Addiction is not a disease. It's simply a nasty habit." He also says that if addiction is a disease, though, why do most addictions end spontaneously and without treatment? Why do some 75% of heroin-addicted Vietnam vets kick the drug when they return home? These are good arguments, however, it still doesn't recognize addiction as something that we need to be concerned about. One of the definitions the Oxford Dictionary gives for addiction is a particular quality, habit, or disposition regarded as adversely affecting a person or group of people. If addiction is a nasty habit, as Kyle Smith says, wouldn't that just be considered a disease? The main definition given for disease, also by the Oxford Dictionary, is a disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, especially one that has a known cause in a distinctive group of symptoms, signs, or anatomical changes. Addiction affects the brain's function by slowing it down and making it to where the dopamine from natural rewards feels insignificant. This is a problem often seen in porn addiction. Porn addiction is rarely seen as being as bad as something like drug or alcohol addiction. While it does not have the same physical side effects, the mental toll porn addiction can take on a person is heavy. In an article titled "Porn Isn't the Problem," Ari Tuckman says that watching porn and then feeling bad about it is the same as feeling bad about eating veal, but then ordering it anyway to later regret. Just because we feel or want something doesn't mean we are required to act on it. He also says that being an adult means thinking about and reconciling these competing desires, values, and priorities to reflexively say porn is bad avoids this important and sometimes difficult self-reflection and the growth that can come with it. I agree when he said we are not required to act on something we want or feel. However, sometimes there is no choice. Often, porn addicts want to stop, but no matter how hard they try, they can't escape. They keep returning, knowing that it will make them feel good in the moment, but terrible later. R.A. Tuckman claims that just as alcohol doesn't force people to drive drunk, so too porn doesn't force people to view it. He later talks about how porn addicts need to figure out why they are doing it so they can make better choices. He doesn't seem to understand the lack of choice in the matter. Just because porn doesn't force someone to view it doesn't mean it's easy to stop. Porn addiction, like any other addiction, causes a flood of dopamine that feels better than a natural reward. When the addict feels that dopamine, they want to experience it again and again, no matter how bad they feel later on. R.A. Tuckman, like Kyle Smith, downplays how bad addiction is and how hard it is to escape it. After all this, you're probably wondering, what am I able to do about this issue? The final things I want to talk about are what we as ordinary people can and should do about addiction, and what we as Christians can and should do about addiction. The first step to helping an addict is for them to recognize and admit that they need help. Only after that happens can they move to the next step. Every addiction is different and should be treated as a separate case from the rest. Some people use alcohol as ways to unwind and cool off, but that becomes their only escape and they can't fix it. Instead of drinking after getting chewed out by your boss at work, maybe try meditation or taking a walk to clear your mind. There doesn't always need to be a huge treatment for addictions. Unfortunately, that does not always work, and sometimes medication is required. There are various medications, such as methadone to help with opioid withdrawal symptoms or disulfiram to help with alcohol addictions. Addicts can also stay in hospitals or treatment centers to manage their symptoms. Therapy is another way to help with addiction and help the addict recognize and understand their addiction in order to break the cycle. To help an addict as an outsider, first, do some research. Make sure you understand what they are going through and how to help them. Observe their behavior over a few days or weeks to understand their problem. Share your thoughts and observations with other people close to them and see how they view the situation. Contact a professional to help you and give them details. Also, make sure yourself and other people are clear from harm. Do not be afraid to take action early. Act before negative consequences happen, not after. A lot of people simply don't know how to bring up the topic to the addict themselves, so here are a few tips. Do not bring up the subject when the addict is under the influence of their addiction. They will be less able to understand logic and will be more dismissive. Don't be under the influence yourself. Make sure it is at a time where you have more than a few minutes of alone time. Make sure they know that you care for them. List the behaviors you and others have noticed. Use open-ended questions and make a two-way dialogue so that they do not feel lectured or badgered. Remember that your goal is to let them know you believe there is a problem, not to convince them that there is one. Do not speculate or judge, as it is important to not get sidetracked. Do not expect a dramatic shift in behavior, and finally, be prepared for the long haul, as it is not a quick fix. Now for the biblical view. Falling into addiction is falling into temptation. Every addiction is from the world. 1 John 2:15 says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. Anything that is in the world is not from the Father, and loving these things will result in sin." Other verses like Proverbs 21 and Ephesians 5:18 tell us not to be led astray by alcohol. We are often told in the Bible that we are slaves to sin, and addiction is the same. It controls the addict, leading them farther into temptation. Even when an addict recovers, the struggle still isn't over. They should also repent and be changed. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Our minds must stay rooted in Christ. We should be completely transformed by him to know him and his will. Throughout this thesis, I first covered what addiction is and how it works. I explained different types of addiction and why they should all be taken seriously. I also described how addiction is becoming more common and even romanticized in today's world. Finally, I discussed what we can do to help addicts recover and how to prevent addictions from happening in the first place. Now I ask you, what happens if we choose not to act? What if, after the day is over, we all go home and just continue to ignore all these problems? What if we all just say, "That's not my problem," and move on? If we do that, things will only continue to get worse. Addicts won't recover, and more addicts will be created. All of these addictions, from drugs to alcohol to social media and pornography, will simply spread like a wildfire, destroying lives without remorse. If you are a current addict and continue to not seek help, it will only make you more miserable. Addiction is a lonely path if you do not rely on others. It is not exaggerating to say that addiction will ruin your life if you let it. The challenge now is to take the next step and help, whether it's helping yourself or someone else. It doesn't take much. Sometimes all it takes is a conversation with a friend or a loved one. Also, look out for those around you. Galatians 6:2 calls us to carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. As Christians, we should be willing to help each other in any situation. If you notice any behaviors that indicate addiction, do not be afraid to speak up and help. It could save a life. If you are falling into addiction yourself, seek help. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. God is always there for us, and he will provide a path for us. There are plenty of resources you can use to help fight off your addiction and win the battle. I will now conclude with the words of Robert Downey Jr., who once said, just because you are at rock bottom doesn't mean you have to stay there. Thank you. All right. Any questions? Bryson. Okay, so the question is, why are things like heroin and cocaine illegal while other addictive things like cigarettes are legal? All right. So I didn't really research that. However, I would assume that, totally lost my train of thought now. I would assume that that it isn't the addictive nature that makes things illegal, it's the harm that they cause. And things like cigarettes would take years to cause harm to a person, while things like heroin and cocaine are more like instant, Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Do addictions that happen in adulthood happen in childhood?
So the question is, do addictions that happen in adulthood also happen in childhood?
The addictions that are in adulthood start in childhood.
Okay, so the question is, do the addictions that are in adulthood start in childhood? That they can happen, or they can start in adulthood or childhood. Typically, the ones that start in childhood often make it to adulthood, as their brains are unable to let go of the addiction at a young age. Does that answer your question? All right. Yes.
Do you think the main reason people don't addiction, people don't receive the treatment is because they think they don't need it?
So the question is, do I think that people who don't receive treatment or do they think that they don't need it? I worded that terribly, but at least I got the point across. I think that is definitely part of it, as one of the first steps to helping somebody treat addiction is that they need to admit that they need help, and that is often a very difficult thing to do. So I think most of the time they do think that they don't need help. Any other questions? Yeah.